The air on October 11th, 1887, carried a peculiar and ominous clarity. It was a cold that did not just bite at the skin, but seemed to leach warmth directly from the bone. Ilara Vance felt it as she stood on the rise overlooking her modest 160 acres, a parcel of land that was both her inheritance and her prison. The wind, a constant resident of the Dakota Plains, scoured the last of the stubborn brown leaves from the cottonwoods lining the creek bed, leaving their branches skeletal against a sky the color of faded slate. She was 19 years old. She was a widow of 1 year and an orphan of 3. The land, the barn, the small, drafty farmhouse, and a debt of $74 at the mercantile were all that remained of her family line. The previous winter had been a brutal tutor. It had taught her the precise anatomy of starvation, the subtle gradations of frostbite, and the profound, soul-crushing silence that follows the death of hope. Her husband Thomas, a good man with strong hands and a weak constitution, had been taken by pneumonia in the heart of a January blizzard that had buried them for 3 weeks. She had survived on salted pork, grim determination, and the last of their firewood, which she had burned so sparingly that the frost had crept across the floorboards and climbed the very walls of their home. When the thaw came, she was gaunt and hollow-eyed, a ghost in her own house. The memory of that cold was not a memory at all. It was a physical presence, a phantom limb that ached with the promise of its return. This year, she vowed, would be different. This year, survival would not be a matter of chance, but a product of design. For weeks, she had pored over the journals left by her maternal grandfather, a man she barely remembered, but whose presence filled the cramped pages with intricate diagrams and methodical scientific prose. He had been an engineer in the East before a restless spirit drove him west, and he had filled his notebooks not with accounts of gold or glory, but with obsessive studies of thermodynamics, wind dynamics, and the ingenious earth lodges of the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples. He wrote of thermal mass, of the Earth's stable temperature below the frost line, of the way a structure could be a partner with the landscape rather than an adversary. Her plan, distilled from those dense pages, was both radical and, in its own way, profoundly simple. She would not try to fortify the existing farmhouse, a structure built with more optimism than lumber. Instead, she would use the largest and sturdiest building she possessed, the great, timber-framed barn, as a primary shield. Inside the barn's cavernous central bay, protected from the direct assault of wind and snow, she would build a second, smaller, and far more efficient shelter. It would be a semi-subterranean structure, an arched dwelling dug into the earth, using the ground itself as its principal insulation. It was a house within a house, a core of warmth and life nestled within a shell of cold, dark wood. On October 14th, she walked the 4 miles to the small settlement of Prairie's End. The town consisted of a mercantile, a smithy, a church, and a dozen houses huddled together as if for warmth. She went before the informal town council, Aldous Finch, the mercantile owner, Mr. Gable, the blacksmith, and Reverend Michael, not for permission, but for supplies on credit. She presented her list with quiet formality: 20 lengths of green ash, 200 feet of milled planking, a roll of heavy oiled canvas, and a small cast iron stove, the kind used for laundry rooms or workshops. Aldous Finch, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his waistcoat, and whose opinions were as broad as his shoulders, peered at the list over his spectacles. He was the town's patriarch, a position he had assumed by virtue of being the first to arrive and the loudest to speak. "Ilara, my dear girl," he began, his voice a condescending balm, "this is a substantial list. A new woodshed, perhaps? Sensible. One must have a season's worth of wood, properly cured." "It is not for a woodshed, Mr. Finch," Ilara replied, her voice even and steady. She refused to be intimidated by the three men who sat before her like provincial kings. "I am building a winter shelter inside my barn." A thick silence settled in the room, broken only by the ticking of a mantel clock. Mr. Gable, a man of few words and much sweat, shifted his considerable bulk on the small chair. Reverend Michael steepled his fingers, a mask of pious concern on his face. It was Finch who finally broke the silence with a short, barking laugh. "Inside the barn? A house inside a house? Child, what foolishness is this? Has the grief addled your senses?" "My senses are quite clear," Alara stated, her gaze unwavering. She would not explain the principles of thermodynamics to these men. She would not speak of her grandfather's journals or the elegant physics of an earth lodge. They would not understand, and what they did not understand, they would mock. "The farmhouse is indefensible against the kind of winter we had last year. The barn provides a windbreak. The structure within will be insulated by the earth itself. It is the most efficient and logical course of action." "Logical?" Finch scoffed, his face reddening. "It is logical to build a proper home, with a proper foundation and a proper hearth, as our fathers did. It is logical to trust in God and the good sense He gave us, not to go burrowing in the dirt like a prairie dog. What you propose is unnatural. It is a waste of good lumber that could be used to reinforce your actual home." "I require $27.50 in credit," Alara repeated, ignoring his rhetoric. "The harvest from my quarter section of wheat will cover it, with interest, come spring. You have my word." "Your word?" Finch leaned back, the picture of magnanimous authority. "We are not questioning your honor, Alara. We are questioning your sanity. We have a responsibility to look after our own, especially a young widow left in such a delicate position. We cannot, in good conscience, enable such a fool's errand. Reinforce your home. Bank the walls with sod. That is the proper way. We will extend you credit for nails and tar paper for that purpose, and nothing more." The other two men nodded in solemn, bovine agreement. Not one of them had lost a family member to the cold in their sturdy townhomes. Not one had burned through their entire wood supply by February, and not one, Alara knew, would admit they could possibly be wrong. She looked at their faces, Finch's smug certainty, Gable's simple-minded deference, the Reverend's placid condescension. She felt a cold, hard anger settle in her stomach. It was not a hot, fleeting anger, but a dense, heavy thing that gave her strength. "Very well," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. She turned and walked out of the mercantile, the men's pitying looks following her like a physical weight. She had known they would refuse. In a way, she had counted on it. Their rejection severed the last thread of dependency. The project was now entirely her own. She returned to the farm not defeated, but resolved. That evening, by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, she took inventory of her true assets. She had the barn. She had the earth. She had her own 2 hands and the accumulated knowledge in her grandfather's journal. And she had one other thing, a small, heavy leather pouch hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. It contained her mother's wedding jewelry and $47 in silver coins, a secret emergency fund her father had insisted they keep. It was everything she had left in the world. The next morning, she hitched her single plow horse to the buckboard and began the 16-mile journey to the larger, more anonymous town of Redemption, where no one knew her name and no one would question her purchases. The work began on October 18th, 1887. The air was crisp, the ground firm. The first task was the excavation. The barn was a massive structure, 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a central aisle wide enough for a hay wagon. It was here, in the very heart of the building, that she marked out the dimensions of her sanctuary, a rectangle 14 feet wide and 20 feet long. She took up a spade and broke the hard-packed earth. The labor was immense. a relentless cycle of digging, lifting, and hauling. The barn, which had always seemed so vast, now became an intimate workspace. The rhythmic scrape of her shovel against the dirt and the squeal of the wheelbarrow's axle were the only sounds. Each shovelful of earth was a small victory. She was not merely digging a hole, she was carving a space for life out of the indifferent geology of the plains. She dug down 4 feet, a depth her grandfather's notes assured her was well below the typical frost line. The soil changed as she went deeper, from dark, rich topsoil to a dense, heavy clay. She piled the excavated earth meticulously along the sides of the barn's interior, a resource to be used later, not a waste product to be discarded. It took her 8 days of relentless, back-breaking work. By the end, her hands were blistered and her muscles screamed in protest. But the pit was dug. It was the foundation of her survival. Next came the framing. This was the most complex part of the design, requiring both strength and precision. She had purchased 24 green ash saplings in Redemption, each about 6 inches in diameter and 20 feet long. Her grandfather's journal contained detailed instructions for steam-bending wood, a technique used by shipwrights and wheelwrights. She constructed a steam box from a long wooden crate and an old wash boiler. It was a crude apparatus, but it was functional. For 3 days, the barn was filled with hissing steam as she fed the ash poles into the box one by one, letting the hot vapor soften their woody fibers until they were pliable. Working quickly before the wood cooled and hardened, she and her plow horse, a patient beast named Silas, bent each pole into a perfect arch. She had driven stout oak posts into the ground on either side of the pit, and she secured the ends of the arches to these posts, creating a series of curved ribs that spanned the 14-foot width of her excavation. Placed every 2 feet along the 20-foot length, the 11 arches formed a skeletal tunnel, a wooden nave that looked like the upturned hull of a great ship. The geometry was ancient and perfect, designed to bear an immense load. She then ran long planks of milled pine horizontally along the arches, securing them with 3-inch nails, creating a solid, curved roof and walls. The cost of the wood and the 1,000 nails had been $16. The following week was dedicated to the critical process of insulation. This was where her design diverged most sharply from the conventional wisdom of Prairie's End. Their solution to cold was fire. Hers was mass. She first unrolled the heavy, black-oiled canvas she had bought, a significant expense at $7. With painstaking care, she draped it over the entire wooden structure, overlapping the seams and sealing them with pine tar she boiled herself. This was her waterproof membrane, the barrier that would keep the dampness of the earth from penetrating her living space. It was her structure's skin. Then began the final act of construction, returning the earth she had excavated. She started with the thickest, toughest squares of sod she had set aside, laying them grass side down directly onto the canvas. This sod layer would act as a binder and a secondary barrier. After that came the loose soil. For another 4 days, she moved the mountain of earth she had created, wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, piling it over the arched frame. She packed it down, walking over the structure, tamping the soil until it was dense and firm. She piled the earth 3 feet deep over the apex of the arch and banked it even thicker along the sides, until her wooden frame had vanished completely, subsumed into a smooth, man-made hill rising from the floor of the barn. Her shelter was now one with the ground, a part of the geology it was designed to defeat. It possessed an immense thermal mass, capable of absorbing and holding heat for days on end. The final details were a matter of function. The front of the structure, which faced the main barn doors to the south, was not buried. Here she built a vertical wall of thick stacked sod bricks, leaving openings for a single, small window and a heavy, insulated door she constructed from 2 layers of planking stuffed with straw. Inside, the space was compact and cell-like. The floor was packed clay, hard as stone, which she covered with thick wool blankets. A small bunk was built into one wall, and in the center, she installed the small cast-iron stove, its flue pipe rising straight up and venting through a carefully sealed opening in the barn's roof. This stove was not intended to fight the cold, but merely to supplement the warmth held by the earth. Her grandfather's calculations suggested that a small fire for 2 hours in the morning and 2 in the evening would be sufficient to keep the interior at a stable, livable temperature, regardless of the maelstrom outside. The total cost in coin had been $38.20. The cost in labor was incalculable. By mid-November, it was complete. From the outside of the barn, nothing looked different. But inside, where hay bales and farm implements once stood, there now rose a strange, grass-covered mound, a tumulus dedicated not to the dead, but to the living. When Aldous Finch and 2 other townsmen rode out to her farm on a pretext of checking on her welfare, they saw the structure and stood in stunned silence. Then, the ridicule began.
"Good heavens, girl," Finch sputtered, his attempt at a jovial tone failing to mask his disgust. "You've built your own tomb." Another man, a farmer named Jebediah, poked at the sod wall with a thick finger. "A root cellar is what it is. You planning on wintering with the potatoes, Alara?" The men chuckled. It was a cruel, dismissive sound that echoed in the vast, cold space of the barn. "It will be warm," Alara said simply, offering no further defense. She did not need their approval. The quiet hum of the wind finding its way through the barn siding was a reminder of what was coming. Her structure was not built for their eyes, but for that wind. "Warm with damp and worms, I'd wager," Finch declared, turning to leave. "Mark my words, you will be begging for a place by a proper fire in a proper house before the first real blizzard hits. This is an indulgence in foolish grief, a folly. See that you come to us before you catch your death in this dirt pile." They rode away, leaving her in the growing twilight, their laughter hanging in the frigid air. Alara spent the next month methodically preparing. She moved her scant furniture into the earth lodge, a small table, a chair, her grandfather's trunk of books. She stocked the shelves with tins of food, sacks of flour and beans, and salted meats. She laid in a modest but sufficient supply of firewood, stacking it neatly against the interior wall of the barn, near the entrance to her shelter. She did not need a mountain of wood, only enough to fuel the small stove for a few hours each day. She patched the holes in the barn's roof and reinforced the main doors against the inevitable snowdrifts. While the rest of Prairie's End put their faith in their fireplaces and their thick log walls, Alara put her faith in physics. The first snows came in early December, a gentle dusting that was beautiful and benign. The cold deepened, settling over the prairie like a shroud. Alara moved into the Earth Lodge full-time on December 15th. The first night, the temperature outside dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the barn, it was perhaps 20. But inside her sod-covered sanctuary, with no fire lit, the ambient temperature held at a steady 48 degrees, the latent warmth of the deep earth radiating slowly into the small space. She lit a small fire in the stove for an hour. The temperature rose to a comfortable 65 degrees and stayed there for the rest of the night. She slept soundly for the first time in months, a deep, dreamless sleep, secure in her earthen womb. The old year died, and 1888 was born in a sheath of ice. The cold was relentless, a siege that wore down the spirit.
travelers brought news of hardship from other settlements, of cattle freezing in the fields, and of families struggling to stay warm. The residents of Prairie's End grew grim. Their woodpiles, which had seemed so immense in October, were shrinking at an alarming rate. The wind, that tireless enemy, found every crack and crevice in their homes, forcing them to huddle ever closer to their ravenous fireplaces, which consumed cordwood with frightening speed, yet seemed to produce more drafts than warmth. The morning of January 12th dawned with a strange and unsettling calm. The sky was a milky, yellowish gray, and the air was unnaturally still and heavy. The temperature was a deceptively mild 20 degrees. Ilara, however, recognized the signs her grandfather had described in his journals. This was the breather, the deceptive peace before the atmospheric onslaught. She spent the morning securing everything one last time. She brought her horse Silas and her 2 milk cows into the most sheltered part of the barn, ensuring they had ample hay and water. She checked the seal on her door and window. Then she retreated into her lodge, lit the stove, and settled in with a book. Around noon, the world outside dissolved. It did not begin with a few flakes of snow. It began with a sound, a low, guttural moan from the northwest that grew rapidly into a deafening, inhuman roar. The sky vanished, replaced by a churning, horizontal wall of white. The temperature plummeted. Within an hour, it had dropped 50 degrees. The wind struck the barn not as a gust, but as a solid object, a physical blow that made the massive timbers groan in protest. It was a blizzard of a magnitude no one living had ever witnessed. It would later be known as the Schoolhouse Blizzard, the Great White Hurricane of 1888, a storm that killed hundreds across the plains with its terrifying suddenness and ferocity. Inside her shelter, Ilara was only dimly aware of the storm's true power. She could hear the shriek of the wind, a muffled, distant howl, filtered through the barn walls and the 3 feet of earth above her head. The fine, flour-like snow was driven through the tiniest cracks in the barn's siding, and soon the interior of the great structure was filled with a swirling, ghostly mist of white. But none of it touched her. Her small window looked out onto a scene of pure chaos, a maelstrom of white that blotted out all distinction between ground and sky. Yet inside, the air was still. The temperature held at a steady 62 degrees. The little stove consumed its fuel with a quiet, efficient hiss. She was an island of calm in the heart of a hurricane of ice. In Prairie's End, it was a different story. The storm hit the exposed town with the force of a tidal wave. The wind, clocked at over 60 miles per hour, tore at roofs and shattered windows. The snow, finer than dust, was driven through keyholes and under door sills, accumulating in ghostly drifts inside the houses. The primary enemy, however, was the cold. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, then 30, then an almost unthinkable 42 below zero. With the wind chill, the effective temperature was a lethal 80 degrees below zero. Aldous Finch's well-built home, the pride of the town, became a torture chamber. Despite having a fire roaring in the massive stone hearth that was large enough to burn whole logs, the wind found its way in everywhere. Frost formed on the walls farthest from the fire. Water froze in a bucket not 10 feet from the flames. His wife and 2 children were huddled with him, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. They were feeding the fire constantly, but the house was losing heat faster than the fire could produce it. Their woodpile, which was supposed to last until March, was being consumed at a terrifying pace. It was the same in every house. Mr. Gable's home, adjacent to his smithy, was filled with the acrid smoke of him burning green wood and even old furniture in a desperate attempt to stay warm. The Reverend prayed, his words turning to frost in the air of his own church. Panic began to set in. They were trapped. To venture outside was certain death. To stay inside was to slowly freeze as their fuel ran out. The structures they had trusted, the homes built according to the proper way, were failing them. They were coffins of ice. The storm raged without pause for 24 hours. Then, on the afternoon of January 13th, the wind momentarily slackened, and the blinding wall of white thinned just enough to see glimpses of a transformed world. It was during this brief, deceptive lull that Jebediah, the farmer who had mocked Alara's root cellar, made a desperate attempt to check on his livestock. His own barn had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow. As he struggled through the waist-deep drifts, his eyes stinging from the ferocious cold, he happened to glance in the direction of the Vance farmstead, a mile to the northwest, and he saw it. Through the swirling chaos of snow, he saw a thin, almost imperceptible plume of gray smoke rising straight into the air from the roof of Alara Vance's barn. It was not the frantic, billowing smoke of a desperate, roaring fire. It was a calm, steady, and impossibly normal-looking wisp of smoke. It was a sign of life. More than that, it was a sign of control, of warmth being generated with methodical efficiency, not frantic waste. The sight struck him with the force of a revelation. The girl in the dirt pile was alive. And if she was alive, she was warm. He stumbled back to the center of town, half frozen and gasping, and burst into Finch's Mercantile, where several men had gathered, seeking safety in numbers. "The Vance girl!" he choked out, his beard a solid mass of ice. "There's smoke! A steady fire!" The words hung in the frigid air. They looked at each other, the same thought dawning in their desperate minds. The folly, the tomb, the dirt pile. Aldous Finch, his face gray with cold and a dawning, terrible fear, felt a profound shame wash over him, a feeling so foreign it was physically painful. He had mocked her. He had called her a fool. And now, his own children were shivering uncontrollably in the next room, and his woodpile was nearly gone. Her foolishness might be their only hope. "We have to try to get there," Finch said, his voice raspy. The decision was one of sheer desperation. To go out into that storm was madness, but to stay was a slow, certain death by freezing. They cobbled together a rescue party of 4: Finch, Gable, Jebediah, and another young farmer. They wrapped themselves in every layer of clothing they possessed, tied ropes around their waists to keep from being separated in the whiteout, and set out. The journey of that single mile was an epic battle against the elements. The wind had returned with a vengeance, and the snow was so deep it was like wading through frozen quicksand. The cold was a physical presence, a malevolent entity that sought to steal the breath from their lungs and freeze the blood in their veins. They navigated by memory and instinct, following a fence line, their heads bowed against the relentless, sand-blasting ice crystals. It took them nearly 2 hours. They were near the end of their strength, their bodies succumbing to the first stages of hypothermia, when they finally stumbled against the solid wall of Alara's barn. The great doors were drifted over with 10 feet of snow. For a panicked moment, they thought they were trapped outside. But then Gable, using his brute strength, found the smaller side door and managed to force it open against the packed snow. They fell inside, one after another, into the relative calm of the barn's interior. The scene that greeted them was surreal. The inside of the barn was filled with a fine, swirling dust of snow and was brutally cold, easily 20 degrees below zero. Their breath plumed in thick white clouds. But in the center of the vast space stood the sod-covered mound, a dark, quiet hill in the midst of the frozen chaos. A single, small window glowed with a warm, yellow light, and from a vent pipe above, the faintest wisp of heat shimmered in the frigid air. It was a vision of impossible sanctuary. Finch, his face numb and his spirit broken, stumbled toward the small, heavy door set into the front of the mound. He raised a frozen hand and knocked weakly. The sound was pathetic, swallowed by the roar of the wind outside the barn. He knocked again, harder. The door opened. Ilara Vance stood there, framed in the warm light. She was wearing a simple wool dress. Her face was calm. She was not shivering. Behind her, they could see the small, clean interior. It was warm. A book lay open on a small table next to a steaming mug. The air that washed over them from the opening was not just warm. It was a gentle, life-giving heat, devoid of the drafts and smoke that plagued their own homes. She looked at the four men, at their ice-caked beards, their desperate, terrified eyes, and the snow that covered them from head to toe. She registered their shock, their shame, their utter defeat. She saw Aldous Finch, the man who had called her a fool, now looking at her as if she were an angel of deliverance. She felt no triumph, no surge of vindication. There was only a great, weary sadness. "Come in," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the storm. "Close the door behind you. You are letting out the heat." They crowded into the small space, which was no more than 10 feet by 18 on the inside. The warmth was shocking, a physical balm that made their frozen flesh ache as circulation began to return. They stripped off their frozen outer layers, their movements clumsy and slow. Ilara handed them tin mugs of hot coffee she had brewed on the small stove. They drank it greedily, the warmth spreading through their chests. No one spoke for a long time. The four men, leaders and patriarchs of their community, simply sat in humbled silence, absorbing the impossible reality of the space. It was utterly still. The roar of the storm was a distant, muted whisper. The air was fresh and dry. The small stove radiated a gentle, constant heat that warmed the earth walls, which in turn radiated that warmth back into the room. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem of survival. Finch looked at the small pile of wood next to the stove. It was barely a day's supply for his own fireplace, yet here, it was clearly enough for many days. He finally understood. She was not fighting the cold. She had simply sidestepped it. "My family," Finch finally managed to say, his voice cracking. "My wife, my children are at the house." "The storm is supposed to break by morning," Ilara said, her tone factual, not emotional. "We can bring them here then. There is enough room. For now, you must rest and get warm." She did not say, "I told you so." She did not need to. The gentle, 65-degree air of her earthen lodge said it for her. Her quiet competence was a more profound indictment of their arrogance than any words could ever be. The blizzard finally blew itself out on the morning of January 14th. The world that it revealed was alien and terrifying. The landscape was a sea of white, with snowdrifts burying houses to their eaves and obliterating roads and fences. The sun shone from a brilliantly clear sky, glinting off a world that had been scoured and frozen. The official temperature was 36 degrees below zero. As soon as it was safe, Ilara and the four men, now rested and restored, made their way back to the town. They brought back Finch's family and several others whose homes had become unlivable ice caves. For the next 2 days, Ilara's small earth lodge became a sanctuary, housing 15 people in crowded but life-saving warmth. She shared her food and her fire without a word of reproach, moving with a quiet efficiency that shamed them all. When the full accounting was done, the toll on Prairie's End was grim. 4 people had died in their homes, frozen to death while huddling by fires that had finally gone out. Dozens more suffered from severe frostbite. Nearly all of the town's livestock had perished. The settlement was broken, devastated by a storm it had been utterly unprepared to face. In the weeks that followed, a profound change occurred. The town's hierarchy, built on bluster and tradition, had been shattered. Aldous Finch, humbled and diminished, publicly acknowledged his folly. He stood before the congregation in the freezing church and spoke of his own pride and ignorance. He told them how he had mocked the wisdom of the very person who had ultimately saved him and his family. He spoke of Alara Vance not as a foolish girl, but as a prophet whose foresight had shamed them all. The Earth Lodge inside the barn became a place of pilgrimage. People came to see it, to touch the earthen walls, to feel the stable, quiet warmth within. They asked Alara questions, not with condescension, but with a desperate, genuine curiosity. She brought out her grandfather's journals and explained the principles to them: thermal mass, the insulating properties of Earth, the importance of a windbreak. She taught them not as a victor, but as a patient instructor, sharing essential, forgotten knowledge. That spring, they did not just rebuild, they rethought. Guided by Alara and her grandfather's notes, they began to incorporate the principles of her design into their own structures. They built smaller, more efficient homes. They banked their walls with thick layers of sod. They learned to respect the prairie not as a thing to be conquered, but as a powerful force with which they had to coexist. Alara Vance, the young widow they had pitied and ridiculed, became the quiet, undisputed sage of Prairie's End. She had not sought vindication, but it had come to her nonetheless, delivered by the wind and the cold. She had proven that survival was not a matter of brute force or blind faith, but of understanding, humility, and the simple, elegant wisdom of the earth itself.